The next thing I want to work on is building a responsive Navbar with Tailwind. So since Tailwind as a framework encourages a mobile-first workflow, we're going to start with the mobile layout. Now the workflow that I find the easiest with Tailwind is to start by just putting all of the HTML structure in place and then adding the styling after the fact. So why don't we start by creating a header element here. And now in most of these navbars, they're usually broken up into like maybe 2 or more pieces. You can think there's usually like the logo and stuff on the left, and then on the right is where you'd have all of the links, or on mobile, it's where you maybe have like a hamburger menu icon. So why don't we create 2 divs for each chunk? So we'll have a div for sort of the stuff that goes on the left, and then we'll have a div for the stuff that goes on the right. I think it would be cool to use like a dark background for this header, so I've gone ahead and created an inverted version of our logo that will work on a dark background, and I've added that to the public directory, so we can just grab that at image /logo inverted.svg. We can add some alt text here, so we can just say workation. And since we're starting with the mobile layout, why don't we go ahead and just add a button with a hamburger icon in it on the right hand side. So I'll create a button element here. We'll give it a type of button, and then inside of it, I'm just going to paste this SVG that I have in my clipboard for a hamburger menu icon. Now this, of course, looks nothing like how we want it to look, so let's start by adding some basic styles. First, let's go ahead and add a background color. So why don't we try something like maybe BG Gray 800, see how that looks? Let's go a little bit darker, BG Gray 900. And we can't actually see this icon, the hamburger menu icon, so let's go ahead and add some classes to the SVG so that shows up. Why don't we try like H4W4, and you can see it there, it's black, so it's kind of hard to see, so let's give it a color so it actually stands out. Why don't we do something like fill current so that we can use the text color utilities to style it. And let's go ahead and add a text color to the button itself so that we can change it on focus and stuff if we want to kind of add some different styles. So if we just start with like text white, that should show up. And I think this actually looks a little bit small, so why don't we bump this up to maybe H6W6, see how that looks. Yeah, I think that's going to be a little bit closer. I think the white is probably a little too high contrast, so why don't we tone that down? Maybe we'll do like maybe like gray 300, see what that looks like. Maybe even a little bit darker. What about like gray 500? Yeah, I think that'll look pretty good. So then maybe on focus, we could do something like text white. So that way, when you tab to it, it gets lighter. Let's also get rid of that focus ring. Since we are adding our own focus styles, we don't really need to have that separate glow. I think we could probably also make it go white on hover, so you can actually kind of see that you're hovering over it. So why don't we do the same thing there? So we'll go hover, text white, and focus text white. And now, yeah, when you hover over it, it changes color. Next, this logo is obviously way too big if we just want it to be over on the left. So the way that I'm going to style this is by just adding a height and leaving the width set to auto. So we're going to add a class here, and why don't we do something like H6 and see what happens there. I think that's probably a little bit too small, maybe like H8. And width is going to be auto by default, so this way the image is just going to take up whatever space it needs to width-wise based on the height in order to preserve sort of the intrinsic aspect ratio of the image. Okay, now we have to get this button over to the right-hand side of this menu somehow. So how are we going to do that? Well, in the past, you might have done something like float right when you needed to do this sort of thing, right? So this kind of sort of works. You can see it moves it over to the right, but things are kind of screwed up still. And this ends up being a real pain to get right and to do it in any sort of like clean and maintainable way. These days, it's much easier to build this sort of layout using flexbox. So let's delete this class, and I'll teach you a little bit about how flexbox works. So the first thing we need to do is add the flex class to the parent element that holds sort of the left side and the right side. And this will turn it into a flex container. Now, what happens when you make something a flex container is that the children, by default, get laid out left to right with no space in between them, which is really convenient if you've ever dealt with that problem where you're trying to build columns or something and just having like white space in the editor creates like a tiny bit of a gap between things. With Flexbox, there is no gap, which is really nice. Now, to control where each piece sort of ends up, we can use the align items property and the justify content property. To make this a little bit easier to teach, I'm going to add another element here that we're not actually going to keep, just so you can understand sort of how this works better. So why don't we add like this login text, and we'll go ahead and make it white so you can actually see it. Okay, so now we have 3 pieces. We have the logo, we've got the login text, and we've got the button. So you can arrange these things in sort of two dimensions. Align items controls where these elements are positioned vertically, and justify content positions how they're arranged horizontally. So let's focus on align items first. So by default, align items is set to stretch, which means that both of these divs are filling the full height of the parent container. The easiest way to see that is to add like a background color here. So say we were to add like BG gray 700, you can see, yeah, this block that contains the word login is full height. And the same thing is true of the div that holds the button. Now, if we wanted to align these items to the top instead of stretching them, all we have to do is set align items to flex start, which we can do in Tailwind using the items start class. So now you can see this item isn't full height. You can see the background sort of shrunk because these elements are now positioned right at the top. If we wanted to align them along the bottom, we could use items end. Now, the reason that the button didn't move in this case is because button elements are inline block by default, which means they're affected by line height. So this element is actually a little bit taller than it looks. If we set this to be a block level button, you'll see that the button does jump down to the bottom. So here's another option that you'll probably be really excited about. Say we wanted to center these items. Well, unlike back in the old days where doing this was a total nightmare and you had to do weird things with line height or tables and all sorts of crazy crap, these days you can just do items center. Now all these items will be perfectly center aligned. Isn't that beautiful? Okay, so for this navbar, we probably do want to use item center. Like I think it makes sense for this button to be centered with this logo. So let's stick with item center and start talking about how justify content works, which is what we use to lay elements out horizontally. So by default, justify content is set to flex start, which means all of the elements are kind of butted up together on the left side. If we wanted to put things on the right side, we could use the justify end class. And now you can see, yeah, everything jumps to the end. We can also use justify between, which will put an equal amount of space between every item, which is really nice. And we can also use justify around, which will put an equal amount of space around every item. So you can imagine that like this element here is like this wide, this one here is this wide, and this one here is this wide. So a couple really cool, interesting options. Now for our use case, we want the logo to be all the way on the left and the button to be all the way on the right. So I think justify between is the one that we're going to want to stick with. Now we don't actually need this login text here. We just had that there for sort of demonstrative purposes. So let's get rid of that and then spend a couple seconds here just sort of cleaning up these styles. I don't think we want everything to be sort of full width here. We probably want a little bit of horizontal padding. So I'm going to head up to this element here. And why don't we try something like maybe PX4 to add some left and right padding, and then maybe something like a PY2 for some vertical padding, maybe even PY3. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So that's a quick sort of overview of how you can sort of build these really common layouts using flexbox instead of a bunch of hacky floats and stuff like that. And in the next lesson, we're going to talk about making this button actually work to pop open sort of a section where we can add these links on mobile. Okay, next I want to add this sort of link drawer that should appear underneath Navbar when you click the menu button to open it up. So same approach as we took before. I think the first thing we should do is just add a bunch of the markup and then style it after the fact. So after this div where the button is, I'm going to add a new div that can hold all of these links, and then I'm going to drop in a few links. So we'll just make them go nowhere for now, and we'll just kind of make up some places they could go. Since this is Workcation, like a site where you can sort of list properties that people can take workations at or rent properties to go to for a workation, maybe we have some categories like list your property, or maybe something like trips for the trips that you've booked, or maybe like messages for talking with the host, kind of like Airbnb-ish. So let's just save this and see what we get and figure out what we have to do next. Okay, so you can see things jumped around a little bit and you can't quite see it, but if you look, actually, we do have a couple of links hiding here on the right. Now, obviously, we want these links to appear below, so let's figure out the best way to do that. I think the easiest approach would be to just add an extra wrapper div around this content so we can make this a flex container and have this div appear underneath. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this header and I'm going to duplicate the closing tag as well. And I'm going to move the closing tag up here since we want it to wrap this content. we'll sort of outdent this stuff. Instead of making this one a header, we'll just make this a div. And then we'll move around a few of these classes. So the header shouldn't be flex anymore. So let's get rid of this stuff. And I think the padding should also live on this element, since this is the one at the top that has the logo and the button. So we'll get rid of that. But the background color we will keep here, because I think I want to use the background color for the entire thing. So that means we can get rid of the background color here. And with any luck, this should look a little bit better. Okay, so now we actually have the links below. Kind of hard to see, but if we highlight them, you can see it. But we want these to probably be like stacked on top of each other. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make each one of these links display block instead of display inline like they are by default, and that'll cause them to stack. So I'm just going to use multiple cursors here so we can add some classes to these links all at once. So we'll just go with display block so things stack. I think we probably want the text to be a little easier to read than being the same color as the background color. So why don't we go ahead and make the text white for these links as well. And I think maybe we'll use like a slightly fatter font, like a higher font weight. So why don't we go with maybe like font semi-bold? Yeah, I think that actually looks kind of nice. The spacing is a little bit off, so let's kind of figure that out. We don't want these going all the way to the left edge. We probably want it to sort of feel more like the same padding that we have for the top part of the navbar. So why don't we start by just adding some padding to this container. So why don't we do px4 to match the padding that we had up here. And that looks a little bit better, but I think we also need some vertical padding. So why don't we try just doing something like PY3, just like we had on the nav bar at the top. See what that looks like. I think this actually doesn't look too bad at the bottom, but we do have a lot more padding than necessary at the top. So why don't we split this up? Maybe we'll do like PT2 and like PB3. See what that looks like. And actually, you know what? Let's add a little bit more bottom padding. Let's go with like PB4 at the bottom. So now we have the same amount on the left as we do at the bottom. I think this looks okay. Things still look a little bit tight though, and I think that's actually the space between each one of these links that I don't really love. So before we get into sort of fine tuning the space between each one, I want to think through like what our hover state is going to be, because that might affect what we do here. So right now you can see you just get like the cursor, but no sort of visual indicator in the UI itself that these are actually links. A treatment that I kind of like is to do like a background color. So maybe when you hover it, you get sort of like a soft gray kind of background. So it just kind of looks hovered. So why don't we try adding that and see what it looks like. So maybe for each one of these, we'll do something like hover BG gray 800. Since we're using 900 for the main background, 800 is kind of the next step up. So this is sort of as subtle as we can go. I think in general, this actually looks pretty good. I don't like the square corners though. So why don't we add rounded corners on hover? So we can just add rounded corners all the time since they're not visible except when you're on hover. And that looks a little bit better, but I don't really love how the text goes all the way to the left edge. So I think we should add some horizontal padding to each one of these links. So why don't we try something like PX2 and see what that looks like. So I think that actually looks pretty good for the links themselves, but I don't like how the text doesn't line up with this left edge anymore. So why don't we subtract the padding that we added to each link from the container. So instead of doing PX4, we'll do PX2 here so that this 2 plus this 2 equals the 4 above. And yeah, I think that's actually starting to look a little bit better. I think we could probably add a little bit of vertical padding too, maybe just like the minimum amount, like PY1, see what that looks like. Yeah, and this is starting to look a little bit better, I think. Now, right now, these are stacked kind of directly on top of each other, so you can see there's like no space between the links as I move my mouse cursor up and down. This is sort of a judgment call. You could go either way, I think, in terms of having a tiny bit of space or just having them stacked right on top of each other. I think I like the idea of having a little bit of space, so I'm going to add maybe MT1 here. And yeah, now you can see we've got a little bit of space between each one, which is kind of nice, and we got quite a lot of room to breathe here. We don't actually need the margin top on the first one, since there's nothing to sort of push it away from, so let's remove that. And yeah, I think what we have here actually looks pretty nice. So final step, I think, is to get this drawer sort of opening and closing when we hit this button. So this isn't really a Tailwind thing. We're going to do this in Vue.js, but I think it's useful to sort of see how we're going to do that and what Tailwind classes we're going to toggle and stuff like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a piece of state to our Vue component here called isOpen. We'll set that to false by default, and this will just track, whether or not the menu is actually open. So if the menu is closed, then we actually don't want to show this section, right? So let's add a conditional class here using view. So we'll say if isOpen is true, then we want to set this to display block, which is the default for divs, so that's visible. Otherwise, we want to use hidden and set it to display none. So now you can see that by default it's hidden. If we toggle this to true, it should refresh and be open. Yeah. So next, let's make the actual button trigger this toggling. So really easy to do. I'm just going to add an @click here, and I'm just going to say whenever someone clicks this button, isOpen should become the opposite of whatever it already is. So now if we go ahead and click this button, we should see that, yeah, it works. Now one tiny change that we could make right now, this hamburger icon stays as a hamburger icon even when it's open. I think it'd be nice if it changed to an X when it's open. So I have another SVG icon for an X in the clipboard that I'm just going to paste in here. So what I've actually done is I've just copied the path because the actual SVG sort of wrapper element had the same view box, and we're going to use the same size and the same color and stuff because we don't want things to jump around. So because SVG is just HTML, we can actually just swap out the path inside the SVG instead of swapping out the entire SVG. So what we want to do is this one is the X, so we want to show this one whenever the menu is closed, and we want to show this one whenever the menu is open. So let's just say vif is open. So if isOpen is true, then that means we want to show the X so that you can close it. And if isOpen is false, so if not isOpen, then we want to show the hamburger menu icon. So now if I go ahead and click this, you'll see it turns into an X, and when I click the X, it turns back into the hamburger menu icon. So there you go. We've made this toggleable. Inside of it, we've got these links. We've got some nice hover states and stuff like that. And in the next lesson, we're actually going to work on making this properly responsive so that we can show these links up in the navbar once we actually have room for them to fit. Next, let's work on making this navbar actually responsive. So we started by building just the mobile layout. You can see here, when we click the button, the links show up, and when we click the button, the links close. But even when we get up to like Tailwind's small screen size, which is 640 pixels wide, I think we probably have room to fit all of these links right here in the navbar instead of having to use the hamburger menu. So let's work on making this actually work the way we want. So the first thing I'm going to do is hide this hamburger menu once we get to the small screen size. So we can do that by adding a class to the div that's holding it and giving that a class of smHidden, which says give this display none on small screens and above. And now you can see the hamburger menu is gone. We can bring these links into view by adding a smBlock class, which says on small screens, give this a display of block no matter what. And again, because Tailwind's responsive classes apply from whatever breakpoint they start at all the way up to the highest screen size, what this is actually doing is overriding the hidden class here and saying no matter what this is set to, whether it's block or hidden, once you hit the small screen size, it should always be blocked so the links are always visible. Next, if we want these links to actually appear beside this workcation logo, I think we're probably going to want to use a flexbox, right? Just like we did with the button. So if we want all of this stuff to appear on the right, what we need to do is find the parent container, sort of the nearest ancestor of both the div containing the logo, which is this div, and the div with the links, and give that a class of flex on small screens and above. So if we say smFlex, that should put things next to each other. And if we say justify between, that should slam it all the way over to the right. Next, let's make all these links actually appear in line next to each other as well. So there's a couple ways that we could do that. We could take all of these links and instead of making them display block like we are here, we could just switch them to inline block at this screen size by adding an SM inline block class to all of these. So that would be something like, SM inline block. And that would basically do the trick. But I think an approach that I actually like a little bit better in this case is to just make the container a flex container, just like we did for the header, because that'll automatically make everything line up horizontally. And then we can sort of control the positioning of these links however we want. So instead of making this SM block, why don't we make this SM flex? Since flex acts exactly like a block level container, except it makes its children flex children. Okay, so now you can see we've got a couple funky alignment issues here. So because both of these links have MT1, they're being pushed down a little bit lower than this link. So why don't we go ahead and remove that from these? So I'm just going to add at the very end here SMMT0, sort of overriding that. Now, instead of having top margins, since these items are next to each other, I think we can probably add some left margins, so there's a little bit of space between each one instead. So why don't we do something like SMML2, something like that, see what that looks like. So now we have a little bit of space between each one, which I think actually looks pretty good. The next thing I want to look at is sort of the surrounding space around everything. So right now you can see like the margin on this side, or the padding on this side rather, is quite a bit less than we have on this side. So why don't we take a look at what's causing that? So right now we have all this padding on the container wrapping all of the links that's sort of there to make things look the way they're supposed to in the sort of stacked view. But since things are next to each other now, we probably don't want it to have the exact same padding. So I'm going to start by just setting this to P0 and see what that looks like, just like removing all padding entirely. Okay, now you can see obviously it goes way off to the right and way up to the top. If we wanted to simulate the padding that we're using around this logo, we could duplicate these classes. We could take this like px4, py3 and add it to this container as well. But I think a better way to handle that would be to actually move this padding to the parent container, this container, when we're in this sort of desktop view. To me, it makes a little bit more sense, when possible, to just use like one declaration to handle the padding for the entire container. Instead of just duplicating this on both the left half and the right half, if we can just apply all of this to the parent, that's kind of simpler because we can change it in one place if we need to. So I think we do need to keep this here for when we're on the mobile screens, but we can add it up here on desktop screens as well and remove it from this div on the desktop screens. So why don't we do something like SMPX4, SMPY3, and then down here we'll do SMP0 to remove it. And now you can see we do have that sort of even padding around the entire thing. Now the last thing to sort of look at is the alignment of this text. So right now we aren't doing anything to sort of vertically align this in any special way. So maybe we could add something like SM items center to center it. And you can actually see that this doesn't change anything. So what that says to me is that these items happen to be the exact same height as this logo, so you don't actually notice it. But if this was to be like, say, H12, now you can see these stay centered, whereas if we were to get rid of this class, they're going to float to the top. So I do think we want to say that they should be centered just in case the heights ever were different or we did want to change the height. But that doesn't actually have any visual impact on what we're doing right now. So let's take a look at how this works. So this seems to work okay at this screen size, right? We got the logo over here, we got the links over on the right, everything's okay. As we go up to bigger sizes, you can see the layout just stays the same. We don't need to make any tweaks at these screen sizes because everything fits on the small screen size, so those changes will just cascade all the way up to the largest one. But once we drop down below 640 pixels, like 375 here in this sort of like mobile view, you can see everything switches back to how it was before. And if we did everything right, we shouldn't have broken this layout at all. And it looks like we didn't. It looks like everything still looks good. So that's kind of how we can take this mobile nav bar and make it fully responsive so it works on both mobile screens and desktop screens.